Hello, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Meg Z. I'm trying out a new microphone today. So, today we are going to be doing my September wrap up. I read a whopping total of 10 books, primarily because I was on vacation. That's why. And a lot of those authors were either of Arab or Asian descent. I read all women, and there was some nonfiction and fiction mixed in. So, if that sounds interesting to you and you want to hear my opinion, sit back, relax, grab a drink, a snack. This will be another long video. I think I have to stop reading so much because I don't want to keep making 40-minute videos. And we'll get into it. The first book I read was called Revenge of the Mooncake Vixen by Marilyn Chin. I got this in a little free library, lending library around my neighborhood. I have never read anything quite like this. The back of the book makes it sound like this is a novel about two twin Chinese American girls, Mooney and Mei Ling, who work for their parents' Chinese fast food restaurant and are delivery girls and drive all throughout Los Angeles. But this isn't one story. This is a collection of interlinking short stories. And they're not even all short stories, they're more like little vignettes. It's very cartoony. I feel like it's sort of like reading a literary version of a comic book. It's a little bit crass. It gets a little bit into softcore porn. So basically, the collection follows these two Chinese American girls, Mei Ling and Mooney, and how they're pretty much raised by their Asian grandmother. And the grandmother is sort of like this matriarch. She does not take any kind of crap. She is this axe throwing woman who she ends up running the restaurant. There's some allusion to the girls' parents, but they don't really stick around. They leave. The father dies very early on. There's themes of assimilation and the immigrant story and the sexualization, hypersexualization of East Asian women, but it's done in this way that is very satirical and self-aware. The two sisters, Mooney and Mei Ling, are supposed to be these polar opposites. They're sort of like this, I think, this take on the Madonna whore complex. Mei Ling is very hypersexual. She's always running off with various men, and Mooney is asexual. She has no interest, although we do sort of, she does allude to being closeted, a lesbian. I don't know. I found like these stories were hit or miss. Like I said, it was a little too cartoony for me. I had some, I think the beginning of the novel, or not the novel, the beginning of the book and the end of the book are the strongest. One of my favorite stories was Round Eyes, which is a sort of like it's a magical realism story of how Mooney wakes up one day and she has double eyelids without any kind of surgery. And it's supposed to be this metaphor for American assimilation as well as assimilation into beauty standards. There's a couple good quotes in here that I did want to highlight. One of my favorites was I think this was in Round Eyes. My father used to say that only in America could you reinvent yourself. Morons become presidents, fools become princes, bandits become CEOs, whores become first ladies. Now, keep in mind this book was written in the 2000s. This is not after Trump. And there are some references that do feel a little dated, like references to Bush and the Iraq War. A good section of the stories are a retelling of Chinese folklore and Buddhist scripture. And they're just like these little vignettes. But unless you have knowledge of Chinese folklore, you probably are going to be a little bit lost. Like what she's doing here, retelling it and reworking it in this modern context, I couldn't feel appreciated because I don't have that background or understanding. So like I said, this was okay for me. Again, a little bit too cartoony. I get what she's doing, but it was a little bit too satirical and self-aware at times. I ended up keeping it for now because I don't have anything like this in my collection. So I would rate it 3 stars. The next book I read was An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. I'd heard about this book for quite a bit, and I ended up reading it because it was on the New York Times Best Books of the 21st Century. So I thought, let me check it out. And I was a little disappointed. This was not what I had imagined. The novel is about a young African American couple. I believe this was set in the early 2000s, Roy and Celeste. And Roy, on a trip to Louisiana visiting Celeste's parents, Roy is falsely accused of rape, and he is sentenced to 12 years in prison. And Roy and Celeste are these upwardly mobile, middle class, college educated, HBCU educated African American couple who Roy is really just clawing for the American dream. And in the blink of an eye, that's all gone. And so when he gets out of prison, his wife Celeste ends up taking up with their best friend, Andre. And I'm not giving anything away because this is on the inside flap. When I read this, I thought this would be a deeper exploration of how being in prison affects families, specifically the detrimental effect mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex has on all of our relationships around us, particularly on African Americans. And Roy's time in prison and even the breakdown of his marriage with Celeste is glossed over. And so it feels sort of like a plot point to move the story into this messy love triangle between Roy, Celeste, and Andre. And it felt like it got into a Lifetime movie. And I mean, I was interested because I was like, how is this going to end? This is a mess. When Roy is in prison, those 12 years, well, actually, they're shortened because he gets out early. So it's like 5 years. But he and Celeste communicate via letters. And I felt like that was such a cop-out because this happened so early on. Their characters aren't really developed enough, let alone their marriage. And so as their marriage disintegrates, we're sort of told this, but we're not shown. And that for me was the biggest issue. It alternates between 3 different perspectives, Roy, Celeste, and Andre. I felt Andre's perspective was not necessary. We could have cut all that out and just focused on Roy and Celeste. And I also wanted to root for someone, and no one in this was really likable. I think because Celeste, there isn't this like deeper illustration of how much having her husband in prison wears on Celeste. We're just sort of told this in a summary. And so she comes across as sort of self-centered and cold. And then Roy, you want to feel sorry for him, and you do, but he's also super patriarchal. He has these super patriarchal notions about how a woman should behave, specifically how a wife should behave. And you're reading this and you're like, is this like, what? Is this the 1950s? I don't know. For me, I didn't, it wasn't what I was expecting. I wanted more of an exploration, like I said, of the breakdown of their marriage, of how prison affects people. And it just didn't really go in that direction. So for me, it was very mid. It was very mediocre. I would rate it 3 stars. So the next book I read was Behind You is the Sea by Susan Muaddi Darraj. This was also a bit disappointing. I haven't read anything by Susan Muaddi Darraj. She's a Palestinian American writer. I hadn't really heard of her before. I know she does write children's books, but her writing is very simplistic. And because these interlinking short stories about Palestinian Americans in Baltimore set over the span of the past 20 years, 2000s to the present, a lot of the stories focus on young adults, high schoolers, and college age, and that combined with the very simplistic writing felt YA to me. And it's not bad, but I don't read YA unless I'm doing a proofreading project. The collection was sort of hit or miss for me. It was nice to see, again, I am all for Arab American representation, especially Palestinian, because, you know, they're so dehumanized. The stories for me, there was like 3 standout stories in this collection. Mr. Amar gets drunk at the wedding, cleaning lentils, and escorting the body. Mr. Amar gets drunk at the wedding is one of the fathers in the community, and there's a wedding between his son and this non-Arab woman. And the funny thing about this story was the dialogue. It touches on how Islamophobia affects people who aren't even Muslim, but who are perceived as being Muslim. The one story, Escorting the Body, follows a son who his father, after he dies, wishes to be buried in Palestine. And so he flies back into Israel to go to the Palestinian territories and bury his father. The son, Marcus, I think is his name, is a cop in Baltimore. And this was interesting. Marcus mentions how he's being interrogated in the Israeli airport. And he notes how the interrogation tactics the Israelis are using is very similar to how he, as a policeman, interrogates suspects. And that's all like the introspection you get. And I thought it was like this missed opportunity because all of these power systems are interlinked. A lot of US police departments are trained by Israel. So if you want to know why our police are so militarized, that's one of the reasons. Like I said, power systems that are interlinked. So that was a missed opportunity, I felt. There's instances where characters their motivations aren't fleshed out. And there's one story where a girl, we see her as like a baby in the first story, and then she's an adult later on when she reappears, and she goes to work for this other Arab couple, and the husband starts masturbating in front of her when she's cleaning, and she doesn't have an issue with it. And then later on, they end up sleeping together. And it's like, what? Like, how are you okay with this? She's so blank and passive. How is that? What your reaction to sexual harassment is that? Like, I need some kind of deeper backstory, some inner monologue as to why you are acting the way you do, because you're not fleshed out to me. It was just very perplexing. So again, like I said, this was hit or miss, but I read a little better. The next book I read was A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. So I avoided reading this for many years because, as someone who has always had a soft spot for alternative rock, punk rock, the whole alt rock scene, I find that when it's written about in a fiction form, it tends to come across as very cheesy. And so that is why I avoided reading this book. She doesn't actually focus as much on music, I think, as you would think. This is a collection of short stories where the characters appear and reappear all throughout. The 2 main characters in this collection are Sasha and Benny. Benny is a well-established music executive. He was formerly a punk rocker himself. In the early 80s, he had his own band, and then he kind of went corporate and is the head of a music record company. Sasha is his assistant, and she's just this wandering, kind of aimless young woman living in we see her youth in the early 90s New York, and she's also a kleptomaniac. And that is actually the first story. The first story that really hooked me was Sasha and this guy Alex on a date, and Sasha stealing a woman's wallet in the restroom. And I was hooked, and I really enjoyed this, and I wish that all of the stories were on this level. I mean, there was a lot of other really good ones. It follows decades from the 70s through the 2020s. I'll get to that in a minute because this book was written in 2010. It's good. She's a good writer, but the thing that ruined it for me was the last two stories. They were clunkers. The second last story is a PowerPoint presentation that Sasha's daughter creates, and the story is told through this PowerPoint presentation. Is it clever? Is it unique? Sure. Does it work? No. It's also supposed to take place in the future, so the future, which is now, but written in the 2010s. And I just had a hard time believing that a kid would create a PowerPoint presentation. This just wasn't realistic for me. It wasn't enjoyable because I don't want to read PowerPoint of all things when I am reading. And I think maybe this was like a commentary on how society is going and we're all becoming more corporate and soul sucked, or I don't know. It didn't work. Even PowerPoint is dated now. I feel it was obnoxious. It was obnoxious and pretentious. I get that she was trying to be experimental, but it did not work for me. And then the last story follows Sasha's one night stand from the first story, Alex, and he has his own family and he's living in Manhattan, and now it's the 2020s. And Jennifer Egan is not a good futurist. She's really good about writing about the past, but she is not good about writing about what she sees 10 years in the future. And that takes a certain kind of skill. And I can appreciate, again, I'm not a sci-fi reader, but if you're writing sci-fi, you have to be, I think, really like aware of how technology and society are moving. And it's a lot of educated guessing. There's giant seawalls in Manhattan that go up and down at the end of the day, and they block out the sun because of the sea is rising. But it was just so like cringe. I don't know. It felt like very much a Gen Xer's idea of what the 2020s is going to be from the 2010s. So these two stories just irked me, and it dragged the collection down. The other thing why I would rate this 4 stars, why I did not see it as a 5-star book, I definitely don't see it as a Pulitzer Prize or one of the best books of the 21st century, is because I don't really, upon reflection, like her main overarching theme. The title, Goon Squad, comes from the saying one character says in the short story collection, time is a goon. That as we all get older, we lose ourselves and our souls and our idealism. And I mean, yeah, the idealism, that's not actually untrue. And your best years are behind you. That's depressing. That's also not original. I mean, tell me something about how people who start their lives over again for the better in middle-aged or older age, like, it's just like, again, this sort of like youth culture obsession. I don't know. I did not find that idea. It rubbed me the wrong way. I don't think it's very original. It's tiring. It's tiresome. Yeah, I mean, it's a solid collection otherwise, but the main overarching theme and those last 2 stories dragged it down for me from a 5-star read to a 4-star read. The next book I read was Rouge by Mona Awad. This was bad. This was really poorly written. This was one of the most disappointing things I have read so far this year. I really enjoyed Bunny. I don't know what the hell this was. I don't know what happened. Like, it's all of the ingredients are there, but it is not executed well. It's like very rough drafty. I don't know if Mona Awad was forced to rush this out after the success of Bunny, but it is very weak. The thing with Bunny was that she was able to write about these really fantastical and absurd situations, but she was able to get away with it because her writing was so good. And that writing is not there in this novel. The novel is about a young woman named Belle. In 2016, her mother dies, And Belle, who was living in Canada, comes to Los Angeles where her mother was, and she ends up taking over her mother's affairs, goes to the funeral, etc., etc. And she finds out that her mother, she had always suspected something weird was going on in the end of her mother's life. Her mother was involved in this very culty, secretive skincare spa. And so Belle tries to figure out what is going on. Belle herself has a skincare obsession. She's obsessed with watching dermatologists on YouTube. And I will say the one thing about this novel I did enjoy was Mona Awad really drags a certain famous YouTube dermatologist. The YouTube doctor in this is so clearly based on Dr. Shireen Idris. She even like appropriates words out of Dr. Shireen Idris's mouth for this character. That an even complexion is next to godliness. That is literally something Shireen Idris says word for word. I mean, I was all for it. Belle finds this pair of red heels that were her mother's, and they magically lead her to this gated spa called La Maison de Méduse. And there, Belle becomes initiated into this culty spa a la Eyes Wide Shut, but this is not like Eyes Wide Shut. Please stop. That's one of my favorite films of all time. That's an insult. Most of the characters, pretty much all the characters, are not fleshed out. Most of them are one-dimensional and flat. There, when Belle comes to her mother Noelle's house where she was living, she finds this handsome, shirtless man named Tad, who is washing her mother's windows, and he's a surfer dude. And I thought, okay, something's going to happen with Tad. He is not who he appears to be. There's going to be some sort of spin on this. No, Tad is just a one-dimensional, flat surfer dude. Then there's a detective who is following Belle. But that doesn't, again, he's just a detective. I thought it was going to turn into something. I don't understand what the point of him was. Was he really a detective? Was he just saying that? I don't know. He was very one-dimensional and flat. And then the mother, Noelle, and we see these flashbacks with Noelle and Belle as how Belle is growing up. Belle is half Egyptian and half French. And so I think a lot of this novel takes from Mona Awad's own experience of mixed background, being Egyptian and European descendant. A lot of there's talk of like these beauty standards of not looking like your mother because you look more like the Arab side of the family and you're dark and hairy and have coarse hair. But maybe because I'm part Lebanese and my mother is very white, like it was just like, okay, tell me something I don't know. I don't know. None of this talk of beauty standards, what she was saying was very original. It's the race and ethnicity and beauty and ageism, they're all touched upon, but on a very surface level way. It's very amateurish. There's nothing more there. Noelle is still somewhat of a stereotype, just the narcissistic mother who is so self-obsessed, she puts herself and her beauty before her daughter. That is very familiar. And the ending, I'm not going to give it all away, but the ending is this. I mean, this is a spoiler, so you can just fast forward. Noelle's spirit and Belle communicate in a sense towards the end. And that dialogue felt very on the nose. Just the way this was written was so convoluted. There was full of purple prose and cliches. Tad's eyes being described like the Pacific Ocean. Please, like, Mona, I know you are a better writer than this. I know you are. You're capable of writing something beyond just cliches and purple prose. It just does not cohesively gel together. It feels like it's trying too hard. Yeah, I was very disappointed in this, and I just think it pales in comparison to Bunny. And I'm not quite sure what I think of Mona Awad as a writer because I've read 2 of her 4 novels. So I guess I have to read a third to really give a fair assessment. But yeah, I don't know. Am I the only one who feels this way about Rouge? Yeah, what a disappointment. So the next book I read was called The Center by Ayesha Manazir Siddiqi. I actually really enjoyed this. It got some mixed reviews, and I'll go into a little bit why I think it got mixed reviews, but I will start with the summary first. So, this is literary fiction, but it does incorporate elements of sci fi and a little bit of mystery and horror. I don't know if that counts as speculative fiction. The story focuses on a British Pakistani girl named Anisa who works on translating Bollywood films. And she just has this general sense of ennui in her life. She's in her late 30s and she just doesn't really, the job is just not, she's not feeling it anymore. She doesn't, her life she feels is very stagnant and she just wants more. And so she ends up meeting and dating this white British guy named Adam. And Adam is fluent in multiple languages. That's what draws her to him. And so they begin a relationship and she tries to teach him Urdu. And he's just not getting it. 6 months and he still can only say like a single phrase. And before they go and visit her family in Pakistan, he goes away on a business trip for 2 weeks. And when he comes back, he's completely fluent in Urdu. He's, and in a way that's not like a rudimentary, just learned Urdu, but he talks like a native speaker, even more fluently than she does. And she's just like, how is this possible? She presses him, and as it turns out, he goes to this top secret program called The Center, where you can become fluent in a language of your choice within 10 days. And he swears her to secrecy. He says, we're only allowed to tell one other person. And it's sort of like this exclusive language resort. You follow this rigorous schedule where you have to give up all contact with the outside world, surrender your phones, you cannot use any kind of computer. You get up every day at 5 a.m., you have a meditation, you have cooked meals, and you listen to hours of a recording of the language you want to learn. And somehow, over the process of those 10 days, you begin to absorb the language, and by the end, you are completely fluent. So Anisa ends up going to the center twice, first time learning German. And despite the center's strict rules about contact, she ends up forging a friendship with a young woman who works there, who's British Indian, named Shiva. And they develop this very close friendship that veers a little bit into the sapphic, goes into the realm of Anisa questioning her identity as if she's queer. Anisa ends up going on to become a fairly well-known, respected translator of novels. It still bothers her as to how the center actually works, and so she keeps prying and scratching. And Shiva, as it turns out, is the daughter of one of the founders, so it takes off from there. So I really enjoyed this. Like I said, I thought it was really well written. My only complaint was that the ending felt rushed. It felt like it should have been much longer. It's only 288 pages, and in the beginning of the novel, we spend so much time on Adam and Anisa's relationship. And then as all these things are happening to Anisa and the big reveal is happening and she goes to India with Shiva, it's just moved along so quickly. And I feel like things are happening to Anisa where she just becomes very passive and okay with it. And I kind of, again, I just felt like the author was rushed. I don't know if someone was pushing her to make this in a certain amount of pages. But I think the things I really enjoyed was just all the different themes. There's a lot of feminist analysis, the analysis mainly of how women are socialized to prioritize their romantic relationships with men above all else, above their female friendships and above their own aspirations and dreams. And there's also a lot of decolonial analysis and examination of Pakistani Muslim identity, specifically in relation to India and India's Islamophobia. I think that this was where a lot of people were complaining and saying these observations were so basic. And I mean, decolonial analysis. It's a novel. This is a novel. It is not an Edward Said text. It is not a heavy, dense academic piece. I think you need to tamper your expectations a little bit. It's basically what I'm trying to say. I overall enjoyed it. I just felt like the ending was very rushed. I feel like there was some symbolism that she could have elaborated on more when Anissa meets the three other founders of the center, because a lot of this novel also deals with power dynamics and power structures and power and privilege and race and nationality and how that all plays out in academia and the linguistics field. And the three other men that Anissa meets, who are the center's founders, one is British, one is American, and one is Israeli. And I thought we were going to go somewhere with this, keeping with the theme of decolonial analysis, as we have three men from three major colonial superpowers, but it doesn't really, it's just sort of rushed and brushed through. And so, yeah, that was really my only complaint with this novel. The next book I read was The Blue Between Sky and Water by Susan Abulhawa. I have actually met Susan in real life many years ago at a gala for Palestinian children. So this is the only novel of Susan's I had not yet read. She has 3, and this, like all her other novels, is a historical fiction novel about generations of a Palestinian family living in Gaza, spanning their exile from their village Beit Darraj to Gaza during the 1948 Nakba. And the novel spans multiple decades, up until roughly 2014. I read this from the library, but there is a note in the Google Kindle version that gives more of a backstory on Gaza on the first page. And I think it is essential, not just for people who read this novel, but for everyone, for people to truly have a better understanding of the present situation. And so reading this novel now in 2024, in light of the current genocide in Gaza, it is even more heartbreaking and infuriating. The book primarily centers on 4 generations of Palestinian women. The 2 that really focuses on are the grandmother, Nazmiya, who survives the 1948 Nakba, and her great niece, who's living in America, Noor. And I hope I'm saying that right. I'll ask my ancestors to forgive me. And this extended family is fragmented as a result of the Nakba. And so eventually Noor makes contact with her family in Palestine. The novel is told from the point of view of Khalid, Nazmiya's grandson, who is disabled from an Israeli airstrike. And through the eyes of Khalid, we encounter this magical realism and time traveling element. Khalid suffers from locked-in syndrome, and Susan imaginatively fills in the gap of any kind of condition where your body is present, but your conscious really isn't. Sort of, she fills in this gap of where does your soul go, even though you're still technically alive. And so Khalid has this omniscient role as a narrator, not just of his family's life in Gaza or of Noor's life in America, but he also can disappear into the past. And so he goes into this sort of other side, or like alternate dimension of Beit Darraj, where the family's deceased are all living and existing as if the Nakba never happened. So overall, it is really beautifully written. And I think for a historical fiction novel, the magical realism and time traveling element works really well. It gives it a unique flavor. I also love the respect that is given in this novel to grandmothers. Nazmiya she's very much respected and revered, not just in her family, but in the community. She's the real glue that holds the family together through all of these traumas outside that are happening. It actually does remind me a little bit of my dad telling stories about his grandmother as he was growing up. She was very much the matriarch of the family. My only thing with this, like a lot of Susan's writing, is at times it can veer a little bit on trauma porn with just what she puts her characters through. That is my one critique of her writing. It just can get to be a lot because she really puts her characters through a lot. And this is even outside of just being a Palestinian. So it does get heavy. That's all of her work. It's beautiful, but it's emotionally very heavy. And but overall, this is a really good book. I would give it 4 stars. I think it's a beautiful testament to the endurance of family and people's humanity under the darkest of circumstances. The next book I read was a memoir called Fox and I by Catherine Raven. So this is a memoir of a former National Park ranger and biologist, Catherine Raven, who is living in Montana, basically teaching classes in nearby Yellowstone. And in this period of her life, spanning about 2 years, she ends up befriending and developing this relationship with a wild fox. Not a wild fox, not a wild Arctic fox. That's basically the gist of the memoir. I almost didn't finish this though. I actually really enjoyed it, but there was a point in it where I almost didn't finish it. This was in the beginning. The way Catherine Raven writes, I can tell she is first and foremost a scientific, technical writer. She doesn't really have a flow to her writing that I'm used to reading. And the way she writes is kind of scattered and all over the place. And I have to I have trouble sometimes following her train of thought. There were some things in here I think could have just been cut because parts of the beginning half can get very boring and drag on. The chapter called Vole Forest, where she really gets into this like technical, dry, scientific thing. The fox hasn't even showed up yet about the voles that are living on her property and how they bury these seeds, and then these seeds sprout into these different kinds of plants that she thought were something else. And I could have done without the vole forest because that was where she started to lose me, and I almost didn't finish this book. I was like, I don't think I can really read this. And then later on, once she meets the fox, it does pick up. She's an interesting character. She's about as interesting as this fox. That the fox isn't quite, it's not tame, but it isn't your typical fox in terms of how it doesn't understand to be afraid of humans. The fox, she describes really how she developed this relationship with this fox. This fox would come visit her every day at 4 p.m. There were times when he would actually stand on his back legs and put his little paws on the window and look in at her. It really is this delightful friendship, and it teaches her a lot about herself because she's very much a misanthrope. And the way she describes, like, she just wants as minimal interaction with humanity and modern society as possible. She just wants to be left alone. And the way she would describe her misunderstanding or how she would have issues with social interactions, I thought this woman is definitely a little neurotypical. Overall, it's a pretty good meditation on just how much animals, even wild animals, can really have an effect on us, how much they can really change and shape us. And with the fox, she is able to sort of let some of her, not just her misanthropic ways, because she says at the end, she's like, I purposely now try to seek things out, to seek people out in the way that fox, she called him fox, would do. But I think he also enables her to use her imagination a little bit and not look at things in this like very dry scientific way. So yeah, overall, I enjoyed this. I thought it was pretty good actually, and I'm glad I stuck through the Vole Forest. And the next book I read was The Occasional Virgin by Hanan al-Shaykh. She is a Lebanese author. This is translated from Arabic into English. And so there are parts of this novel where I could tell that it was not originally written in English. And it did read a little bit odd, some of the sentences at times. And I think it's really difficult to translate Arabic into English or vice versa because the two languages are totally different. I picked this up in a used bookstore, the Turning Pages Lounge, Bethany Beach, Delaware. Shout out if you're ever in that area. I was really just drawn to this, like, oh, Lebanese characters. That's cool. I do not like the cover though. It looks like chiclet. It's terrible. This book is very lowly rated on Goodreads. I thought it was okay. It didn't blow me away, but I didn't think it deserves 2.49 as a star rating. I actually rounded up when I ranked this. So this actually was originally published under two different stories. It was published under, I think, Two Girls by the Sea was the first story, and then, or Two Women by the Sea. And then the second half of this was published under The Virgin of Londonstone. And so I think what she did was she just kind of combined these stories because they have the same characters into a single novel. It follows two Lebanese women. One is British Lebanese and one is Lebanese Canadian. And they both were raised in Lebanon and they fled at some point during the Civil War. Yvonne is Christian and Huda is Shia Muslim. Both stories deal a lot with themes of identity and religious identity. Both women were raised in conservative religious households. Again, themes of just romantic relationships. Yvonne and Huda are very opposite in how they approach men. Huda seems to have more luck with men, but she's not interested in marriage. And then Yvonne is the opposite and is very desperate to have a baby. And Yvonne actually kind of got on my nerves because I don't know, I just felt like she was an Arab Bridget Jones, and I get a little tired with that. Like, I know it is a valid thing, women in their 30s, some women who really, really want to be married and have a child, but I just get a little bit tired of hearing about it. It's particularly in stories. Sorry. Like, the first half is really about them on vacation at the along the French Riviera. And then the second half, we are back in London. Huda is visiting. She's putting on a play in London. And at this random encounter at Speaker's Corner, both the women encountered this religious fanatic or very deeply conservative Muslim man named Hisham. And Huda ends up tricking him into this. She gets in this sort of situation with him, and then later on, Yvonne also ends up kind of getting involved. And yeah, it's again, there's a lot of rumination on religious identity. And I know the author herself was raised in a conservative Shia family, and she is clearly not religious, because I think that there is a lot of like religious trauma that the author has. And I mean, she also talks a lot about it with Arab Christians as well, and this sort of like very religious conservative culture that is very patriarchal. She focuses more on Huda, and I think because the author is Muslim, she has just like a better firsthand understanding. So Huda to me was more fleshed out than Yvonne, but Yvonne also just got on my nerves. Yeah, overall it's not bad. I would rank it 3.5 stars, but because it got such a weirdly low rating on Goodreads, I don't know why. I rounded up to 4 stars. So I'd like to, that's just me making things a little more even in the Goodreads universe. And then finally, the last book I read was Airplane Mode by Shahnaz Habib, an irreverent history of travel. This also deals with decolonial analysis. Oh my goodness. So this is a nonfiction piece. It is interspersed with some of the author's own travel writing and her own experiences, traveling from everywhere from Turkey, Ethiopia, various places in Europe. But it also is an examination of the birth of the modern travel industry and how much it was influenced, or really a byproduct of, colonialism. There's a lot of really eye-opening things in here that I personally didn't even know. She touches on something she calls, I don't think she invented this term, called passportism. How there is not just only this difficulty in traveling as a brown person, but you have, no matter what background you are, you have an advantage if you have a certain kind of passport from a first world country. And she talks a lot about the difficulties of having an Indian passport. And she gets into the origins of passports, because passports, modern day passports, are again much more of a recent invention. And she touches on how really the whole idea behind the passport isn't so much to freely travel, it's more about restriction and who can travel and enter in this country and who can stay for how long. And it's built upon a lot of these power systems of like surveillance and things like that. She actually talks about how a lot of people, particularly she thinks, in the third world, are really into reading. Reading the world is, for the provincial, an act of self-preservation. It would be pointless for them, people living in these countries, to pretend that they are isolated from the world or that they come first in the world. A butterfly wing flapping in Geneva or Rome or London or Washington, D.C. could well decide the fate of hurricane recovery on an island thousands of miles away. The current dominance of Western culture means that one does not have to travel to the West to find it. So non-Western cultures have learned to live alongside it, carefully assessing its predatory nature while attaining fluency in its tropes. So there's a lot of acknowledgement of the advantage and the privilege of coming from a Western country. Again, a lot of just like I said, all of the birth of the modern travel industry. There's a lot too about even just like how history is written and how we talk about these like Europeans discovering places, or they discover places that they had said, oh, they were abandoned or empty, and they were none of those things. The native people were well aware the native people were living there, but to the explorers, they just saw them as, well, we could just waltz right in. I mean, there's an interesting part of the chapter she talks a lot about too, how we talk about like the first Europeans to visit these foreign countries, the first European to visit Africa, to visit America. But we never talk about the first African to set foot on America or to set foot in Asia, or the first Asian to go to Europe. She talks actually about Orthodox Ethiopian Christians who came to Spain in the 1300s and went around countries in Europe, including Rome, visiting the Pope, because they wanted to have sort of this like strong buttress against what they saw as Muslim encroachment on their territory. And so they were reaching out to other Christians. This is a part of history I had no idea about. She mentions that it's so fascinating because at this time in Europe is already starting to engage in the early aspects of the slave trade. And so you have this happening while these Ethiopian travelers are coming there and visiting Europe as equals on their own terms. So yeah, overall, I think it's pretty good. My one thing though is that she doesn't really offer any kinds of solutions. But I guess that's why it's called Irreverent. It definitely is a lot to think about because I've traveled a decent amount, particularly in my early 20s. I had that privilege too. And so I think it's really something that I think I highly recommend it because it really makes you think, and it's really eye-opening. But like I said, she doesn't really have any kinds of solutions. She talks about how she has sometimes this idea in her head that, and I've suffered this as well, like, oh, well, I'm not like other travelers. I'm doing things the right way. And it's kind of like just living within these systems of capitalism. Like you can't escape it. Like you're just going to become in some way, even if you think you're different, we're all just sort of engaging and consuming in the same thing. So a really interesting topic on the history of travel and the ethics of it, etc. So yeah, that is finally the end of this very long video. And if you like it, comment, like, subscribe, give me a thumbs up. Let me know if you have read any of these books or you have read anything similar. And yeah, I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.